I think that at least this paper, Mindless Statistics, never mentions the assumptions of the statistical test, whether they're grossly violated or not. I mean, the p-value, is it meaningful? You know, that's another thing, but they just never mention it in this paper.
Yeah, so are you thinking of that as something that needs more emphasis in teaching also?
Well, I think that...
Or should we move to a new, discuss that as a new topic?
No, I think it should be part of the teaching.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's something that could get more emphasis, although I think in advanced classes, certainly in the teaching we do at UCSF to fellows, that is one of the major thrusts in each of the lab sessions and so on, is how do you assess the assumptions you're making when you use this statistical method.
Although I think that is another area where we're often teaching rituals. It is so often that I hear, if the data is continuous, then use the t-test. If the data, whether the data is continuous or not, you could use the t-test for binary data, and you would just have a binomial test. It's exactly the same. And you could have continuous data with the t-test is not appropriate. So we have the same problem there as with the 0.05. It is that teachers are often, and maybe that is an answer to Bob's question, when we as teachers are using shortcuts, trying to oversimplify something for our own convenience, that carries a risk. We should question, and we should question ourselves. We shouldn't say, well, I have to teach that because this is what I have done in the past, so I cannot say that I learned something new, and therefore am teaching something that is different from what I have done in the past. I think, that is where I see Gerd's major contribution, that he actually points to the fact that whatever we do in statistics, teaching or applying statistics, that we are under the influence of these subconscious minds, and we have to become a bit more aware of this, and that might help us to become better teachers too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It is very hard, I find, not to slip into some of these problems, even myself, or at least to fail to catch them when I'm reviewing something someone has written. The problems seem to have sort of a natural life of their own, which requires a lot of vigilance. Yeah, that's important. Bob, I see your chat message here. Did you have any further comments other than that these are helpful thoughts?
None off the top of my head, except I do agree with, I think Edith is the one who said this about, the assumptions for p-values or tests, that those weren't discussed in this article. And I think that there's probably several other things that weren't specifically addressed in this article that are relevant to, I guess, to us perhaps doing a better job of teaching these concepts.
But there's one thing where the article addresses that issue, and that is the quote from Tukey, that sometimes it's better to have an approximate answer for the right question than an exact answer for the wrong question. Sometimes it is necessary or better to use a test even if certain assumptions are violated, because the underlying hypothesis suits or is a better fit than to use a test where the assumptions are justified, but the underlying hypothesis is not a good fit. So I think in that sense, the article addresses that issue with a note of caution on not to overemphasize certain rules about assumptions and rather shift the focus on the hypothesis being tested, knowing that most statistical tests are asymptotically distribution-free, and so many of the assumptions are not that relevant, at least when we have a somewhat reasonable sample size.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Knut. Perhaps I was thinking that we could discuss things like you just said in the general sense, but then there's probably a number of statistical topics where we could become more specific and, well, I guess apply maybe this method of thinking to those topics.
Okay, well,
I really
think,
like the idea of using Tukey's quote, though, and elaborating on that to students. That's kind of, I don't think that that's something I've done before in any class that I've taught. So that's one thing I'll definitely keep in mind.
Yeah, let me just comment that I looked closely at the source article for that, and the quote is not quite as good a fit to the comment, the idea that Knut is bringing up as I might have liked. And I think you'll see Gigerenzer actually citing not the 1962 Tukey paper, but a much later paper by a couple of other people about that topic.
Now, so I followed up the references to make sure that I go back to the original. So that was the best I could find.
Yeah, but you know, I found that Tukey was raising some somewhat different or more complicated issues than just trying to stay clear on exactly what you're trying to do. It was somewhat more complicated than that, not as simple as the point that does need to be made, that you need to focus, as you said, on whether you're doing a screening or a confirmatory procedure, for example, which is a very basic point. And I think Tukey's original point in 1962 was somewhat more subtle than that.
Okay, well,
but, yeah,
thanks again. I wasn't intending for my question to necessarily take up our entire discussion.
Well, I think it did cover you know, some very important aspects of the article and important aspects of what Knut sought to bring out in it. So I think it was helpful.